Our next presentation is entitled Fosshé, an innovative method for building flexible, rigid interior supports. Melissa Huddleston is the assistant conservator at the Getty Conservation Institute. She has worked in collection care for museums and private collections throughout Los Angeles, specializing in treatment housing and installation solutions for modern and contemporary archive materials. Recent projects include the recreation of Harold Zeman's 1974 exhibition, Godfather, A Pioneer Like Us, Tango with Cows, The Storied History of a Russian Futurist Artist Book, and Fluxus Means Change, Gene Brown's Avant-Garde Archive. B.J. Farrar is the senior Mountmaker at the Decorative Arts and Sculpture Conservation Institute at the Getty Museum. He has presented on various Mountmaking topics, including advances in the protection of museum collections. B.J. was previously a Mountmaker in the Antiquities Conservation Department at the Getty Villa. And B.J. is also a co-founder of the International Mountmakers Forum, as well as being on the steering committee.
Sorry, it's me again. Unfortunately, my colleague Melissa couldn't join us in person, so I'm going to do my best. This is really her presentation, to not butcher it, so be gentle. So this actually, quickly, this kind of dovetails nicely with Mike's presentation a little bit earlier, so as we get into it, you'll start to see a bit of a connection. So, Fosshé. So this is not a hair product. So in the 1970s, women from all over the world came to Los Angeles to attend a visionary art program called the Feminist Art Studio Workshop. The program took place at the Women's Building, founded by artist Julie Chicago in 1971. Students were encouraged to experiment, collaborate, and draw from personal life experiences. They utilized skills traditionally relegated to the domestic sphere, such as sewing, cooking, and other types of handicrafts. They were encouraged to work in modes outside of the traditional, aka male-dominated fine art media. They embraced the performance, installation art, happenings, site-specific land art, and art as social practice. It was at the Women's Building in 1977 that the artists Anne Gauldin and Jerry Allen met and formed the Waitresses, a performance group that would remain active until 1985. The Waitresses were known for comedic guerrilla-style performances that dealt with timeless, global feminist issues. In an interview, the artist Jerry Allen described the role of the waitress as a metaphor for women's positions in the world. She listed 4 main themes the group focused on: women in work, women in money, sexual harassment, and stereotypes of women, such as waitresses as prostitute, servant, and slave. In an early performance titled Ready to Order, Gauldin wore a pink-clad dress, cascaded in pink lifelike breasts sewn to it, in a 50s-style waitress uniform, while impersonating the great goddess Diana. We affectionately, stating the obvious, refer to this object as the breast dress. It was the central visual element of the performance as she stood in the middle of a busy cafe and delivered a humorous monologue about the thankless role of the all-nurturing goddess. The dress made by Anne and the dress, which was made by Anne, and the breasts were cast from bodies of women in the group. During an interview, Anne described the whole process of them sitting around and having a meeting, and she was just putting plaster on everyone's breasts. She also recalled staging the plaster molds in the back of her car so she could paint layers of latex into the molds during breaks from her day job. In 2018, the dress arrived at the Getty Research Institute as part of the Women's Building Archive. In addition to preserving this special relic, we also wanted to be able to exhibit the object upright on a mannequin and accompany footage of the Waitresses' performances. The breasts had been sewn to the dress at points spaced all around the edges of the various latex molds. Over time, stress pulling on each sewn point had caused the breast to detach, making it impossible to exhibit the dress upright. Lying flat, the dress was lifeless, like a corpse. The primary mechanisms of deterioration for natural rubber are physical stress, environmental pollutants, oxygen, UV exposure, extreme temperatures, and relative humidity. Over time, any plasticizers that are present can migrate to the surface, causing rubber to become sticky and soft. Eventually, it'll slump and harden into deformed shapes. Once hardened, it becomes extremely brittle and sensitive to physical stress of any kind. Because of this tendency to collapse and harden, building a well-fitting support is a crucial aspect of any preservation plan for latex artifacts. When the dress was made, the breast had been stuffed by the artist with cosmetic cotton balls, paper napkins, polyester filling. But over time, this had shifted out of place and had collapsed under the weight of the distortions. The treatment plan for each breast was a multi-step process. Working in groups of 3 or 4 at a time, each breast was removed from the dress, repaired, reinforced with a lining. Distortions were reshaped when possible without damaging the material. The next step was making supports to be seamlessly integrated into the structure of the dress and stable enough to remain there long-term to support each of the breasts. This is the focus of this presentation, but I'll quickly go over some of the treatments just to give a context of how bad condition the breasts were actually in. After a breast was removed, it was coated with Lascaux 303, an acrylic adhesive. Japanese paper mends, pre-coated also with Lascaux 303, were also used to mend cracks and breaks inside the forms. One of the great working properties of Lascaux is that it remains dry. It remains flexible after it dries, but also a little bit tacky, which allows for adjustments to be made during the restorations. Once mended, the form could then be lined with a crepeline, a finely woven silk material that was also adhered with Lascaux 498, which has a stronger bond than the 303, but also remains flexible. The next step was to warm and gently reshape the latex. A large, dry heat bath was assembled. 3mm glass beads were chosen for the main portion of the bath because they were gentle and would slide around each other, allowing the latex form to maneuver easily into place. About 2 centimeters of industrial garnet was placed at the bottom of the pan to absorb heat. Without this layer of garnet, the glass beads would become too hot. With the garnet layer, it was possible to maintain a lower temperature. To isolate the beads from the latex, a layer of muslin was placed over the beads. It took about an hour on the lowest heat setting for the proper temperature to be achieved, which was around 45 degrees Celsius. At that point, the hardened latex began to soften. After being in the bath for a few minutes, some of the dents began to relax. Small dents could be pushed out with slight pressure by hand. Soft, custom-weighted bags were placed inside the form to help hold the shape after the heat was removed. The next step was to create interior supports. The supports needed to be lightweight, semi-rigid, and possible to sew into, and customized to be perfectly fit into the amorphous shapes of each breast cavity. Fosshé, material that we all know well, seemed like an obvious choice and a place to start with. Its non-woven polyester material comes in sheets, can be formed into rigid shapes when heat is applied. And it was the only material that we found that fulfilled all of the criteria needed for this project. The challenge was to find a way to achieve a perfect cast of each breast interior with minimal contact to the fragile latex objects. Obviously, heating the Fosshé in direct contact with the latex was out of the question due to the pressure and high heat levels needed to shape it. This is when Melissa contacted me about the project, wondering if it might be possible to utilize 3D scanning to create 3D printed breast models. This made a lot of sense and dovetailed nicely with a lot of work that we were already doing in the museum with 3D technology and mount making. This is when another beautiful collaboration between a conservator and a Mountmaker was born. We started off by scanning the interior of a latex sample and created a 3D printed positive form to test the accuracy and fit. The results were very impressive. Unfortunately, the printed form, even though very conformal, would be too heavy to be the final support, but it would make a great model to work with the Fosshé. We did a test with Fosshé, forming it over the 3D print. Even though there were some details to work out, this seemed like a promising plan. We decided scanning would take place after treatment was done on each of the breasts, and the interiors were stabilized and the objects were safe enough to handle. I used an Artec Leo HD handheld scanner, which uses structured light to quickly acquire dimensional information. The next step was to scan the treated breast. This was the same workflow that we used for the initial test, which was to scan, model, and print. And I'll touch a bit on this more in a minute. We decided to produce both a positive and a negative 3D printed form to assess which would be better to provide the model for shaping the Fosshé. The positive form was reduced slightly in scale to compensate for the thickness of the Fosshé, and the negative was printed 1-to-1. After some experimentation with the Fosshé, it was determined that the negative form was superior and could create a very conformal interior support. So the next few slides, I'm just going to cover quickly the workflow that I used with the 3D technology to create the negative mold. So after scanning each breast, the raw data was processed in Artec Studio and to produce a 3D mesh of the breast interior. The mesh was then exported as an STL file and imported into Rhino 3D modeling software. In a few situations, some further work on the STL models needed to be performed, and this was done in Mesh Mixer. In Rhino, each imported mesh was oriented best to facilitate the construction of the negative form. Once this had been established, a polyline tracing was made from a top view around the perimeter of the mesh, which you can see here, I think, just in the, around the corners here. The closed polyline shape was then extruded into a solid height that would encase the entire breast form. The solid extruded shape was then adjusted so that a small amount of the mesh protruded around the perimeter, and this is really kind of key in the process. So the next step after that was to do a Boolean difference process in Rhino. And this process would successfully use the mesh of the breast to cut the geometric form that I had created in Rhino. The solid extruded form was then converted into a NURBS, converted from a NURBS to a mesh, and the form was subsequently exported and created into this negative form, as you can see here. The negative form was saved as another STL file and imported into Cura, which some of you are familiar with as a slicing program for our 3D printer. We utilized Ultimaker S5 for this process and a tough PLA material for printing. So, in my opinion, this is sort of the exciting part of the presentation that I'm going to get into. Once the method of creating the conformal shape one method of creating a conformal shape in Fosshé, is to drape it over a form and apply heat to shape it. And this, as we've seen in other presentations, works quite well. But with this particular project, the breasts had a lot of undercuts and very tight shapes that were very hard to achieve with the normal process of shaping Fosshé. So my colleague Melissa, with a lot of experimentations, at some point started delaminating Fosshé into just fibrous strips, and then she started placing them into the 3D printed mold. This is where the name comes from. It's the technique very similar to paper mache. So just bits at a time, she would apply small amounts of Fosshé into the mold, heat it up, continue that process until she had the form made. And the process was hugely successful, beyond everyone's expectation. Not only did we achieve a very conformal support out of Fosshé in detail that I have never seen before with this material, but it also provided more rigidity, and we think that's due to the fact that each part, the multiple layers of the Fosshé were really being heated up and stiffened in the process. So the next step was the Fosshé supports needed to be firmly secured into the interior of each of the breasts. A 5-centimeter strip of crepeline was cut on the bias and was folded in half. A toned linen cord was then sewn into the fold. This would act as an anchor for the Fosshé form to be simultaneously attached to the breast and sewn into the dress. So this is kind of how it all works. One side of the crepeline strip was adhered to the breast using Lascaux 498, while the linen cord in the fold was aligned around the perimeter of the breast. Clips were used to hold the crepeline in place while the adhesive dried. The other side of the crepeline was left loose. The Fosshé interior support form was then placed inside the breast and attached with stitches through the loose side of the crepeline. This was done for further conservation interventions. The form can simply be removed from the breast by simply clipping the stitches. One thing that was done was the Fosshé form was also toned with an acrylic paint around the edges to avoid any distracting flashes of white when viewed from the sides. The final step before sewing the breast back onto the dress was to clean and fill all the final cracks and loose paint losses on the exterior. This step was left until the very end, so the fragile breast could be supported by the Fosshé inserts. So the next few slides are just some before and after treatment examples. The final step was sewing the breast back on. Stitches went around the cord, through the dress, and through the slip, using the original sewing holes in the fabric of the dress as much as possible. Our intentional plan was to redo the artist stitches through the latex for aesthetic conformity, especially in areas where it would be highly visible. Because the latex was so brittle in most cases, we decided that this was not a good approach, and so the material was left alone, and the stitches were done around into the Fosshé forms. The artist came to visit while the treatment was in process and was really taken aback about the transformation of the dress, and commented that it was especially impressive to see the combination of scientific, technological, and artistic practices that are involved in this elaborate collaborative process. And here's an overall comparison before and after treatment. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, BJ. So I have to ask you first, when you began your Mountmaking career, did you ever envision that you'd be giving a talk on the best breast dress in front of 200 people?
And strangely, it was hard to, when I have to do my annual performance reviews, the computer always kicks back the word breast. And bus, and all sorts of other things that we work on. Is Melissa going to be able to? Yes, Melissa. Oh, yeah.
With the before conservation, the breast being obviously like somewhat deformed, how were you able to determine the shape of where they would be placed back against them when you were forming the Fosshé in there? So basically, like, once it was, how did you know what the backside shape would be once it was back on a mannequin and upright around a form?
So this is really a question for Melissa, who I was hoping that would join us.
Do we know Kevin or Nate if she is?
So I believe we're still waiting for her to join on Zoom. So
Okay.
check.
I'll do my best to answer that. It was my understanding that, you know, part of the treatment process was to warm up the latex in the heat bath and reshape as best possible back to the original form without stressing the material too much. So once that had been achieved, that's when I got involved, and then I would scan the breast after a final form was achieved, so that the Fosshé form would then be the final shape for that. I don't know, did that answer?
So I was wondering, my understanding was that you were taking the pieces of Fosshé apart to make a thin enough, malleable enough layer to get into to hit the mold and form just right. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the 3D printed negative form was the mold, and then the Fosshé was delaminated from its traditional state as a fibrous sheet, and those small amounts of fiber then were placed in, like paper mache, placed into the form, the 3D printed form, and heated up and fused together, and so it was built up over multiple layers until the final form was created.
Got it. And I was just wondering, did you ever attempt to contact the Fosshé factory and try to get before like just like fibers or whatever and sprinkle them in or something like that? I wonder if that's possible.
That's a good question. I don't know offhand.
Kind of on the same note, was when stacking the layers of Fosshé, do you know if there was anything needed to be done to retangle the fibers, maybe like needle felting sort of work, or during the heating process, do the fibers adhere to each other?
That's also a very good question. And again, it's very much for my colleague Melissa, but it was my understanding that I wasn't really involved in this part of the process, but my understanding was that she would take the fibers and I don't know if she was cross overlaying them, but it did seem like however she was doing it, that she was using a heat gun, that those fibers were then fusing to each other. But I'm not sure if she was like cross-linking them or just laying them in any sort of particular direction. But I do know that the final form, is far more rigid than like what I've seen with just regular Fosshé being heat shaped. But the detail was impressive. That's, to me, was the real takeaway, that, the forms that I didn't think you could achieve with that material. She seemed to have managed to find a way to do that.
Great. Thank you, BJ.
Yeah.